Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were called the greatest love story Hollywood ever produced. A couple so magnetic, they turned a film set into an international scandal and a wedding into global news. Twice. But behind the diamonds and the headlines was a marriage so violent it earned them a nickname from their own crew, filled with screaming matches that trashed hotel rooms, addictions that spiraled out of control, and a darkness that began even before they ever said their first vows to each other. This is the real story of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Two stars, already trapped in their own lives. By 1962, Elizabeth Taylor was already one of the most famous women in the world, a former child star who had grown up entirely in front of the camera and who had already been married 3 times by the age of 30. Her most recent marriage, to singer Eddie Fisher, had itself begun in scandal, since Fisher had left his wife, actress Debbie Reynolds, to be with Elizabeth following the sudden death of Elizabeth's previous husband, producer Mike Todd, in a plane crash in 1958. By the time she signed on to star in an enormously expensive new production of Cleopatra, Elizabeth's personal life had already generated more headlines than most actresses experienced across an entire career. That pattern of scandal was not new to Elizabeth, even by 1962. Her first marriage, to hotel heir Conrad Hilton Jr., had lasted only 9 months and had reportedly been marked by considerable unhappiness behind the glossy studio publicity surrounding it. Her second marriage, to British actor Michael Wilding, had produced 2 sons, but ultimately dissolved as well. By the time she met Richard Burton, Elizabeth had already spent more than a decade of her adult life navigating a level of public scrutiny over her romantic choices that few other performers of her generation had ever experienced. A pattern that the Cleopatra production would only intensify dramatically. Elizabeth had also, just prior to filming Cleopatra, survived a life-threatening bout of pneumonia that had required an emergency tracheotomy, a health scare so severe that newspapers around the world had briefly reported she might not survive it. A brush with mortality that some biographers have suggested left her approaching the intensity of her new relationship with Richard with a heightened, almost urgent sense of wanting to seize whatever happiness presented itself, regardless of the complications it might bring. Richard Burton, meanwhile, was a celebrated Welsh stage and film actor, already regarded within the industry as one of the finest classical performers of his generation, and already married to Sybil Williams, with whom he had 2 young daughters. Burton had built a reputation not just for his talent, but for his drinking, a habit that had followed him since his working-class upbringing in Wales, and that had only grown more pronounced as his fame increased throughout the 1950s. Burton had grown up the 12th of 13 children in a Welsh mining family, and his early exposure to hard-drinking mining culture, combined with the pressures of a demanding stage and film career, had already established heavy drinking as a consistent feature of his adult life, well before he ever crossed paths with Elizabeth. Colleagues who worked with him during his earlier stage career in London often described a performer of extraordinary talent, whose relationship with alcohol was already, even then, a matter of ongoing concern among those closest to him. Burton had, in fact, been widely regarded within British theatrical circles of the 1950s as one of the most promising classical actors of his generation, drawing comparisons to legendary performers of earlier eras, comparisons that made his later, more turbulent decades all the more striking a departure from the disciplined reputation he had originally built for himself on the London stage. When production began on Cleopatra in Rome in 1962, both Elizabeth and Richard arrived already carrying the weight of their own complicated personal lives. 2 people whose marriages were, in different ways, already showing cracks before they had ever exchanged a single word with each other on set. What happened next between them would not simply add another chapter to either of their already eventful personal histories. It would ignite one of the most explosive and closely watched celebrity affairs in the history of the entertainment industry, unfolding in real time in front of a production crew, the international press, and eventually millions of readers around the world. An affair that nearly destroyed them both before it even began. The attraction between Elizabeth and Richard on the set of Cleopatra was, by every account from those who worked alongside them, immediate and completely undeniable. Both were still married to other people, and the affair that developed between them became public almost as quickly as it began, generating a level of scandal so intense that the Vatican itself issued a public condemnation of Elizabeth's conduct, and members of the United States Congress reportedly discussed whether she should be barred from re-entering the country. That level of institutional condemnation, extending all the way to official statements from the Vatican and serious discussion within the halls of the American government, reflected just how genuinely shocking the affair appeared to much of the public at the time. Divorce and remarriage among Hollywood stars was hardly unprecedented by 1962, but the scale of the Cleopatra production itself, one of the most expensive films ever made up to that point, combined with the fact that both Elizabeth and Richard were still legally married to other people when their relationship became public, gave the entire scandal an outsized cultural weight that went well beyond ordinary celebrity gossip. But long before any of that public condemnation reached its peak, the emotional strain of the affair had already pushed Elizabeth to a genuinely dangerous breaking point. According to accounts from people close to the production, Elizabeth attempted to take her own life on two separate occasions during the filming of Cleopatra, incidents connected to the overwhelming stress of the affair and its consequences, one of which reportedly occurred while Richard himself was present. It was an early and deeply troubling sign of just how consuming and destabilizing this relationship would prove to be for Elizabeth, arriving even before the two of them had made any lasting commitment to one another at all. Those close to the production later described an atmosphere of near constant tension surrounding the two stars throughout filming, caught between the demands of completing one of the most expensive and closely watched films in Hollywood history and the personal chaos unfolding just off camera, as both of their marriages publicly disintegrated in front of an international press corps eager to document every development. Gianni Bozzacchi, who would later become Elizabeth's longtime personal photographer, described the entire dynamic between the two of them as one where their passion had become so strong that it had, in his own words, edged towards something close to genuine destruction, a dynamic he characterized simply as difficult, an understatement given everything that was already unfolding. Cleopatra itself, already troubled by enormous budget overruns and production delays even before the affair became public, saw its final costs balloon well past its original projections, with the scandal surrounding its two leads ultimately generating more sustained media coverage than the film's actual box office performance once it finally reached theaters. Elizabeth's marriage to Eddie Fisher could not survive the affair, and neither could Richard's marriage to Sybil, though Sybil reportedly held out hope for considerably longer that her husband might eventually return to her. By the time Cleopatra was finally released in 1963, both Elizabeth and Richard had extracted themselves from their previous marriages, and the two of them married each other on March 15, 1964, in a private ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Montreal, finally making official a relationship that had already dominated newspaper headlines around the world for close to 2 years. What followed that wedding was not the settled, happy resolution that headline writers might have hoped for. Instead, Elizabeth and Richard were entering into a partnership that would soon become defined by a level of volatility that even those closest to them struggled to fully comprehend. A marriage built on genuine passion, but increasingly overshadowed by alcohol, jealousy, and a pattern of conflict so intense that it would eventually earn the couple an entirely new nickname within their own social circle. the battling Burtons. Almost from the very beginning of their marriage, Elizabeth and Richard developed a reputation for conflict every bit as public and dramatic as the romance that had first brought them together. Friends, hotel staff, and members of their own film crews began referring to them privately as the battling Burtons, a nickname that captured just how frequently and how loudly their arguments erupted, often in hotel rooms, restaurants, and even on film sets, where cast and crew members had little choice but to witness the fallout. That nickname itself, coined by the very people who worked closest to the couple on a daily basis, speaks to just how thoroughly this pattern of conflict had become an accepted, almost expected part of doing business with either Elizabeth or Richard, regardless of which production happened to be employing them at any given time. Those arguments were rarely quiet disagreements. According to multiple accounts from people who spent time around the couple, their fights frequently escalated into full-blown screaming matches, with objects thrown, television sets smashed, and entire hotel rooms left in disarray in the aftermath. Elizabeth herself would later describe these confrontations in strikingly candid terms, telling an interviewer that Richard genuinely enjoyed losing his temper, that it was something almost beautiful to witness, and that their fights functioned as a kind of delightful screaming match in which Richard behaved like a small atomic bomb detonating in front of her. Richard, for his part, once remarked that the two of them would sometimes pick a fight purely for the exercise of it, as though conflict itself had become a kind of shared ritual neither of them could fully step away from. That framing, both of them describing genuinely destructive, sometimes frightening confrontations using language that made the violence sound almost playful or theatrical, offers a striking window into just how thoroughly this pattern had become normalized within their relationship. What outside observers, hotel staff, and crew members experienced as alarming, even disturbing displays of temper, Elizabeth and Richard themselves seemed to have reframed, at least in their public remarks, as simply another expression of the intensity that defined their connection to one another. Journalists covering the couple throughout the 1960s and 1970s often struggled with exactly this same tension in their own reporting, uncertain whether to treat the well-documented volatility of the marriage as a serious cause for concern, or simply as one more colourful, headline-generating feature of two of the world's biggest movie stars living out their romance in full public view. That pattern of explosive conflict was fueled, according to nearly every biographer and friend who studied the marriage closely, by two significant and worsening substance dependencies running in parallel throughout their years together. Richard's drinking, already a well-established habit before he ever met Elizabeth, continued escalating throughout the marriage, while Elizabeth herself developed a serious dependency on prescription medication, a habit that had roots going back to her earliest years as a child star, when studios had routinely given young performers pills to manage both their energy levels and their sleep schedules during demanding production periods. That early exposure to studio-administered medication, beginning when Elizabeth was still only a child actress working under enormous professional pressure, laid the groundwork for a dependency that would follow her in various forms for the rest of her adult life, resurfacing and intensifying during precisely the periods of her life, like her marriage to Richard, when emotional stress was already running at its highest. Biographers who studied this pattern closely have often pointed to it as one of the more overlooked, systemic failures of the old Hollywood studio system, one that left many young performers of Elizabeth's generation vulnerable to exactly this kind of lifelong struggle. The combination of Richard's alcoholism and Elizabeth's growing reliance on pills created a genuinely volatile household dynamic, one where ordinary disagreements could rapidly spiral into the kind of destructive confrontations that hotel staff and film crews came to expect, almost as a matter of routine, whenever the Burtons checked into a new location together. Reports from the era describe hotels renting out entire floors surrounding the couple's suite, anticipating the noise their fights would inevitably generate. A level of institutional accommodation that speaks to just how consistently predictable this pattern of behavior had become. Living on the edge of a volcano. Despite the destructive nature of so many of their arguments, both Elizabeth and Richard would go on to describe the underlying intensity of their connection in terms that suggested they viewed the volatility itself as inseparable from the depth of their feelings for one another. Richard, in his own private diaries, wrote candidly about the nature of life with Elizabeth, describing their relationship as though the two of them were living on the edge of an exciting volcano, acknowledging openly that he was not an easy man to be married to or to live alongside. He wrote about exploding violently roughly twice a year, describing those eruptions as marvelous, even as he also acknowledged, in the very same reflection, that the same intensity that made their connection feel so alive could also, in his own words, turn into something close to murder. Those diary entries, published years after his death, offered biographers and readers alike a genuinely unfiltered look into how Richard himself understood and processed the marriage while he was still living through it, a perspective considerably more introspective and self-aware than the polished, carefully managed statements both he and Elizabeth typically offered to reporters during their years together. The diaries revealed a man who was, by his own admission, fully conscious of the destructive potential simmering within his own temper, even as he continued participating in exactly the kind of behavior he privately recognized as genuinely dangerous. Burton's diaries, spanning decades of his life and eventually published in full by scholars years after his death, remain, to this day, one of the most candid and revealing first-hand accounts ever produced by a major Hollywood star regarding the private reality behind one of the most publicly celebrated marriages of the entire 20th century. That kind of language, applied by Richard himself to describe his own marriage, offers a genuinely unsettling glimpse into just how normalized this level of volatility had become within their household, framed by both of them not simply as a series of unfortunate incidents, but as a fundamental, almost defining characteristic of who they were together as a couple. It was a dynamic that friends and biographers alike would later point to as evidence of a relationship built as much on mutual destruction as on genuine partnership. Two people who seemed to need the intensity of conflict nearly as much as they needed the intensity of their affection for one another. Throughout the marriage, Elizabeth and Richard continued working together prolifically, appearing in 11 films together over the course of their relationship, including Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, a film whose own subject matter, a bitter, alcohol-fueled marriage marked by cruel verbal sparring between husband and wife, struck many observers at the time as an almost uncomfortably direct reflection of the very dynamic playing out in the couple's real life together. Elizabeth won an Academy Award for her performance in that film, a role that required her to draw on exactly the kind of raw, unguarded emotional volatility that had, by that point, become an unmistakable feature of her actual marriage. Critics and colleagues who watched that particular performance take shape on set often remarked on just how little separation there seemed to be, at times, between Elizabeth's portrayal of a bitter, hard-drinking wife locked in vicious verbal combat with her husband, and the genuine dynamic she and Richard brought with them to set each morning. Whether that overlap made the performance more powerful or simply more uncomfortable for those who understood what they were truly witnessing, remains a subject biographers continue to debate. But the parallel itself was impossible for anyone close to the production to fully ignore. Alongside the fighting and the substance use, the marriage was also marked by extraordinary displays of wealth and extravagance, gifts that seemed designed, at least in part, to compensate for or paper over the underlying instability running beneath the surface of their relationship. In 1969, Richard purchased Elizabeth a 69-carat pear-shaped diamond for over $1 million, a ring that would come to be known as the Taylor-Burton diamond, one of the most famous pieces of jewelry in the entire world. That kind of extravagant gesture became something of a recurring pattern throughout their marriage. Lavish reconciliations following equally dramatic blow-ups, a cycle that repeated itself again and again as the years wore on. A marriage that could not sustain itself. By the early 1970s, the cumulative weight of Richard's worsening alcoholism, Elizabeth's ongoing dependence on medication, and years of accumulated conflict had begun to genuinely erode whatever remained of the stability in their marriage. Richard's drinking, in particular, had progressed to the point where it was affecting his professional reliability, and colleagues who worked with him during this period noted a marked decline in his health and his overall demeanor compared to the sharp, commanding presence he had brought to earlier projects in his career. That professional decline carried real consequences for Richard's career during these years, with directors and producers growing increasingly cautious about his reliability on set, a stark contrast to the reputation for discipline and formidable talent that had once made him one of the most sought-after classical actors of his generation. For a man who had built his entire identity around his craft, watching that reputation erode alongside his marriage represented its own particular kind of loss, one that likely compounded the very stress and unhappiness already fueling his drinking in the first place. The couple starred together in a television movie in 1973, titled Divorce His, Divorce Hers, a title that would prove almost eerily prophetic given what was about to happen in their actual marriage. Later that same year, Elizabeth and Richard separated, and in 1974 they formally divorced, closing out a marriage that had lasted just over a decade and that had, by nearly every account, become simply unsustainable given the accumulated toll of addiction and conflict on both of them. Elizabeth herself, reflecting on the end of the marriage, spoke plainly about the effort she had put into trying to save it, telling an interviewer that there had simply been too many differences between them, and that she had tried everything within her power to make the relationship work before finally accepting that it could not continue as it had been. It was a rare moment of straightforward, unembellished honesty from a woman whose entire adult life had been lived under intense public scrutiny, an acknowledgement that even genuine effort and genuine love had not been enough to overcome what had gone wrong between them. That divorce, however, would prove to be far from the true ending of their story. Whatever had drawn Elizabeth and Richard together in the first place, and whatever had made their connection feel, to both of them, worth returning to again and again, despite everything that had already gone wrong, had not been fully extinguished by a single legal proceeding. Within little more than a year, the two of them would find themselves standing before each other once again, ready to make the very same commitment they had just so painfully dissolved. A second chance that lasted less than a year. In October of 1975, just 16 months after their divorce had been finalized, Elizabeth and Richard remarried in a surprise ceremony held on the banks of the Chobe River in Kasane, Botswana. The wedding itself was notably brief and understated compared to the grandeur that had often characterized their years together, with Elizabeth wearing a simple green caftan and the entire ceremony lasting only about 20 minutes. According to reports from the period, though never fully confirmed, Elizabeth's decision to rush back into marriage with Richard may have been influenced by a recent medical scare involving an X-ray, a moment of genuine uncertainty about her own health that apparently pushed her toward reuniting with the one person she had continued to feel most connected to, even after everything that had already gone wrong between them. The choice of location itself, a remote riverside setting in Botswana, rather than any of the glamorous cities or resort destinations more typically associated with the Burtons' extravagant lifestyle, struck many observers at the time as a deliberate departure from the kind of grand, headline-generating spectacle that had defined their first wedding. It was almost as though both of them understood, on some level, that this second attempt required a different kind of energy entirely, something quieter and more private than the public performance their relationship had so often become. That reconciliation, however, could not overcome the same underlying problems that had ended their first marriage in the first place. The drinking, the pills, and the volatile conflict that had defined so much of their relationship from the very beginning had not disappeared simply because the two of them had decided to try again. Less than a year after their Botswana wedding in 1976, Elizabeth and Richard divorced for a second and final time, bringing their tumultuous, on and off relationship to what would turn out to be its permanent legal conclusion. That second divorce arrived with a particular kind of finality that the first one had lacked, given that both of them had already attempted reconciliation once and watched it collapse under the exact same pressures that had ended the marriage the first time around. For those close to the couple, the second divorce carried less shock value than the first, but perhaps more genuine sadness. A confirmation that whatever had gone wrong between Elizabeth and Richard ran deeper than either of them had initially wanted to believe. Both Elizabeth and Richard went on to marry other people within that same year. Elizabeth married United States Senator John Warner, while Richard married British model and actress Susie Miller. Elizabeth, in particular, faced considerable public criticism for her marriage to Warner, with commentators of the era questioning her suitability for the kind of formal, political life expected of a senator's wife, a stark contrast to the freewheeling, headline-generating existence she had spent most of her adult life living alongside Richard. The love that refused to fully end. Despite two marriages and two divorces, and despite both of them building new lives with entirely different spouses, Elizabeth and Richard never managed to fully let go of the connection that had first ignited between them on the set of Cleopatra more than a decade earlier. Elizabeth would later reflect on the end of their relationship with genuine sorrow, telling a friend that she never wanted to love anyone that completely again, describing the experience of loving Richard as having given away everything she had, her soul, her very being, all of it, in a relationship that had ultimately proven impossible to sustain. That kind of raw, unguarded reflection, offered years after the marriage had definitively ended, suggests that whatever destruction the relationship had brought into Elizabeth's life, she never fully regretted the depth of feeling that had accompanied it. It was a distinction she seemed to draw carefully throughout the remainder of her life, acknowledging the genuine pain the marriage had caused her, while simultaneously refusing to characterize the love itself as any kind of mistake. In 1983, 7 years after their final divorce, and with both of them now separated from their respective spouses once again, Elizabeth and Richard reunited professionally for a stage production of Noel Coward's play Private Lives, a project whose own subject matter, a divorced couple who unexpectedly encounter each other again years later while each honeymooning with new spouses, carried an unmistakable and almost uncomfortably direct echo of their own real romantic history. The production toured for 7 months, giving audiences one final opportunity to witness the two of them sharing a stage together, an experience many who attended described as electric, even years removed from the peak of their fame as a couple. Reviews and first-hand accounts from that tour frequently commented on the strange, almost uncanny sense of watching two people whose own history so closely mirrored the fictional couple they were portraying on stage each night. Audiences who had followed the Burtons' relationship for over 2 decades by that point arrived at performances already primed to read real meaning into every line of dialogue, every glance exchanged between the two actors, blurring the line between performance and genuine reflection in a way that made the production feel, to many who saw it, like something considerably more personal than a typical revival of a well-known comedy. Critics who reviewed the production at the time frequently noted this same phenomenon, some praising the added layer of genuine emotional resonance it brought to Coward's already sharp dialogue, others questioning whether the audience was truly watching a play at all, or simply watching two former spouses work through the unfinished business of their own extraordinary shared history in front of a paying crowd. That reunion tour would turn out to be the last time the two of them would work together, and one of the final extended periods they would spend in close proximity to one another before Richard's own life came to an unexpectedly early end. What happened in the final months of his life, and the letter that arrived only after it was already too late for Elizabeth to respond, would become one of the most quietly heartbreaking footnotes to their entire decade-spanning story. A letter that arrived too late. Richard Burton died suddenly on August 5, 1984, from a brain hemorrhage at his home in Switzerland. He was 58 years old, and his death came as a genuine shock to those who knew him, arriving with little warning despite years of heavy drinking that had, by that point, taken a considerable toll on his overall health. Richard had, by the time of his death, been married to his fifth wife, Sally Hay, having divorced Susie Miller and married again in the years following his final split from Elizabeth. Colleagues who had worked alongside Richard in his final years often noted that despite the visible toll decades of drinking had taken on his health, he had continued working steadily, taking on film and stage roles right up until close to his death, a testament to the same discipline and professional seriousness that had defined his career from its earliest days, even as his personal life continued its own separate, often turbulent trajectory. In the days immediately preceding his death, according to accounts that emerged afterward, Richard had written a letter to Elizabeth, reaching out to ask whether she might be interested in trying their relationship one more time, a final, private overture toward the possibility of yet another reconciliation between two people who had already tried and failed at reconciliation once before. That letter, however, did not reach Elizabeth until after Richard had already died, arriving in the aftermath of his death, rather than in time for her to respond to it while he was still alive. The devastating timing of that letter, a genuine, heartfelt gesture toward renewed connection that arrived only once it was already too late to matter, became one of the most poignant and widely discussed details connected to the entire extraordinary arc of their relationship. For a couple whose entire story had been defined by dramatic timing, from their explosive affair on the set of Cleopatra to their surprise Botswana wedding, this final, cruelly mistimed letter offered one last, quietly devastating illustration of just how much the two of them had continued to matter to one another, right up until the very end of Richard's life, even though circumstances had never quite allowed them to find their way back to each other while there was still time. Those who knew Elizabeth in the immediate aftermath of receiving that letter described her as devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary grief for a former spouse, understanding all too well the particular cruelty of learning that Richard had, in his own final days, still been thinking of her and still hoping for the possibility of reconciliation, a hope she would now never have the chance to respond to directly. The letter itself, according to those who later learned of its contents, was reportedly warm and reflective in tone, the writing of a man looking back over the whole of his life with Elizabeth, rather than simply proposing a hasty reunion, adding yet another layer of poignancy to a gesture that had already arrived far too late to matter in the way Richard had clearly hoped it might. Elizabeth herself spoke publicly, years later, about the depth of what she had continued to feel for Richard even decades after their final divorce, telling interviewers that she had, in her own words, remained genuinely and deeply in love with him for the rest of his life, an admission that spoke to just how permanently their relationship had shaped her own understanding of love, despite everything the marriage itself had put both of them through, a legacy of passion and destruction. Elizabeth Taylor would go on to marry one more time after Richard's death, to construction worker Larry Fatensky in 1991, a marriage that would also end in divorce, closing out a personal history that ultimately included 8 marriages to 7 different husbands across her entire adult life. Despite that long and eventful marital history, those closest to Elizabeth often noted that no relationship among all of her marriages seemed to carry quite the same lasting emotional weight as the one she had shared with Richard, a connection she continued referencing even decades later as the deepest and most consuming love of her entire life. Journalists who interviewed Elizabeth throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and into the early 2000s often remarked on how quickly and how naturally the conversation would circle back to Richard whenever the subject of love or marriage came up at all, regardless of how many years had passed since his death or how many other relationships Elizabeth had experienced in the meantime, a testament to just how singularly formative those years together had remained within her own understanding of her life story. That distinction, Richard remaining the singular reference point for the rest of Elizabeth's romantic life, even through a subsequent marriage and years of continued public scrutiny over her personal choices, speaks to just how uniquely formative those years with him had been for her, regardless of everything the relationship had also cost her along the way. Friends who spoke with her in her later years often described someone who had made a kind of peace with the contradictions inherent in that history, able to acknowledge both the genuine damage the marriage had caused and the genuine, irreplaceable depth of feeling that had accompanied it. That capacity to hold both truths at once without needing to resolve them into a single, simple narrative may itself be one of the more honest lessons embedded within the entire story of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. A reminder that even the most extraordinary loves are rarely as tidy or as uncomplicated as the headlines surrounding them tend to suggest. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, at the age of 79, having outlived Richard by more than a quarter century. In the years between his death and her own, she continued to speak about him publicly with genuine warmth, acknowledging both the extraordinary passion the two of them had shared and the genuine destruction that same passion had, at times, brought into both of their lives. In interviews given throughout her later decades, Elizabeth would occasionally return to the subject of Richard unprompted, offering reflections that blended clear-eyed acknowledgement of the marriage's genuine dysfunction with an equally clear insistence that she had never regretted loving him as completely as she had. That balance, refusing to simplify the relationship into either a pure romantic fairy tale or a straightforward cautionary tale about addiction and volatility, became one of the more consistent threads running through how she chose to discuss the most significant relationship of her entire life. It was a nuance rarely captured in the countless magazine retrospectives and documentary specials that continued revisiting their story for decades after both of their deaths, most of which leaned heavily toward one framing or the other, either glamorizing the romance or sensationalizing the dysfunction, rather than allowing both truths to sit together the way Elizabeth herself always seemed willing to let them. Looking back across the full arc of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's relationship, from the scandal-generating affair that first brought them together, through a decade-long first marriage marked by addiction and explosive conflict, serious enough to earn them their own nickname, into a brief and ultimately unsuccessful attempt at reconciliation, and finally to a devastating letter that arrived only after it was already too late, a picture emerges that looks considerably more troubled and more genuinely painful than the glamorous, star-crossed romance the public spent decades celebrating. Behind the diamonds, the 11 films they made together, and the headlines that followed their every move, was a relationship defined as much by genuine destruction as by genuine devotion, Two enormously talented people who seemed, in the end, unable to either fully stay together or fully let each other go. Decades later, biographers, documentarians, and even playwrights have continued returning to their story, drawn by the same magnetic contradiction that made it so compelling to audiences the first time around. A love that was, by nearly every account from the people who witnessed it firsthand, entirely genuine, and a partnership that was, by that same measure, genuinely unable to sustain itself without inflicting real and lasting damage on both of the people caught inside it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.